Okay, hi folks. First, Zen, thanks for the reminder that I need to get this out. I just put my mind, so thanks for um, the note. And also, just thanks to whoever kind of drew this to my attention that we really hadn't spent any time talking about directly these concepts of representation, which are so essential to the first half of the course. And it's a pretty significant oversight on my part. I'm glad that somebody did bring it up, and we can talk about this now. The idea here is that, as I state in the final in the title, we're talking about responding or reacting and managing a problem with a limit to formal representation, and we'll define that in a minute. And as a result, or as offered as a solution to the limitations of formal representation are descriptive and substantive representation. So that's the point here. But what I want to do is kind of first give you a little bit of backdrop on what the whole concept of representation uh, means, and kind of give you some insights into why, as I say here, it's a deceptively complex matter. Um, the kind of classic work on this is still seen to be that of Hannah Pitkin. Her 1967 monograph on representation kind of sets out a basic typology of four modes or conceptions or models of representation. We're dealing with three of them today. So she begins just simply by kind of making clear what we've meant by, the concept of representation by going back to the Latin root for it, presentere, which means to present or to make present, and the Latin prefix re, which always means again. Put together, then we have a concept of representation, which means to make present again. Okay? In kind of our terms, this means that representation is the activity by representatives, by those in positions of power, of making citizens' voices, opinions, and perspectives present in the policy-making process, or to make them appear in the political process. But that just, really begs a fundamental question. Right? What should representatives represent? Right? What does it mean to make present? What should be made present, especially? Should it be citizens' interest? Well, now, at first blush, that probably seems quite obvious, and the answer would be yes. Right? That if they're to do anything, they are to represent the interests of their citizens. But when we add the alternative, or a possible alternative to citizens' interests, that is, their expressed wishes or demands, we see how it can get complicated, right? Because quite clearly, citizens' interests and citizens' demands are not in any way to be understood necessarily synonymous. We can imagine many contexts in which what citizens are asking for may well not serve their own interests. I'm thinking presently of the conflicts in the subcontinent, where we've got hyper-nationalists on both the Pakistani and the Indian side, and it's always the extreme nationalists who dominate who seem to dominate certainly the social media, the kind of narratives. And we have these two sets of extremists that always seem to prefer war, as a solution to the conflict over Kashmir. And it's pretty clear to me that those folks who are keen to call for war as a solution to the Kashmir problem, war between two nuclear powers, don't seem to have a real good bead on what their actual interests are, because clearly, full-scale nuclear exchange between Pakistan and India on the subcontinent would ultimately fail to serve anyone's interests, right? Since it would quite likely kill all of us. So there we have a pretty good example of citizens making demands that perhaps a responsible representative should ignore. Right? Um, but can we really be talking about democratic politics when we just kind of institutionally ignore the express wishes and demands of constituents? No. So, and it's clearly possible that citizens do have a decent understanding of what their interests are. So, given the obvious possible divergence between interests and demands, different concepts, different theoretical notions about representation have emerged over time. Two kind of that prevail or kind of dominate the scene are first the trustee theory of representation. This was advanced by the iconic representation of British conservatism, Edmund Burke, who did serve a term or two in the British Parliament, known as the trustee theory of representation. Now, we've all heard of the concept of trustee, I would imagine, and it makes its appearance in various forms. I can think of just, well, definitionally, what is a trustee? A trustee is one who is entrusted with responsibility for protecting and managing the assets and interests of someone who's not, for whatever reason, in a position to do so him or herself. Okay? We can sort of picture, say, a 15-year-old teenage girl, heiress to a fortune, actually has the tragedy of her parents dying and coming into ownership or possession of the fortune. Now, I don't think there's anybody in the world that would think it would be a good, sound idea to give access to a 15-year-old, a teenage girl, a $3 billion fortune. Okay? It would be much more in her interest to put control and responsibility for the management of her now massive assets into the hands of someone who will do so responsibly, will act on behalf of his charge responsibly. And the teenage girl may, of course, and has the legal right to request funds for whatever needs she may have or interests she may wish to pursue. But the trustee ultimately has, got to have the autonomy and the ability to say no, right? Otherwise, he or she can't act effectively as a trustee. Because, well, if I had been given access to $3 billion as a teenager, I wouldn't be standing there sitting here before you today, that's for sure. So this is the idea of representation from a trustee perspective, that the obligation of the representative is to serve the interests of the constituency, and recognizing that the constituents may well not fully understand what their interests are. They may not have the big picture, as it were, that like nationals calling for conflict between nuclear-armed powers seem not to have a good sense of the big picture, as it were. Right? So the trustee theory of representation implies that there's an important level of autonomy on behalf of on the part of the representative to act when necessary in the face of and in contrast with the express wishes of his or her constituency, and do and act in ways that serve their interests rather than their desires or their demands. Right? So that opens up the door, quite obviously, to possibly ignoring expressly their demands and doing what the representative thinks is best for them, not what they wish. Right? The alternative vision of representation here is advanced by Madison, the delegate theory of representation. And the idea here is, as a delegate, he is or she is sent to simply articulate the voices of the people who have elected him or her. Okay? This implies then a much more restricted or restricted space for autonomous reflection and action, but one is simply there to echo the voices of the constituency. Right? And you can probably imagine that, there are times when a representative ought to act like a trustee, and there are times when the representative ought to act like a delegate, right? There are also, quite obviously, if you reflect upon this for a minute, there are challenges to both, right? Specifically, you could probably fairly quickly come up with a challenge or an obstacle to the representative effectively acting as a trustee, because this is what happened to Edmund Burke. He was voted out of Parliament, right? Because he was so, committed to the ideas of representing his constituency's interests and not what they asked for, that they got tired of that and voted him out and voted someone in they believe would in fact do what they asked. So there are kind of checks, as it were, intrinsic checks, what Pitkin refers to as accountability, that limit the capacity of one to act as a trustee. And if one only acts as a delegate, then one might not be taking one's responsibilities seriously enough to, in fact, serve their interests and the interests of society as a whole. So there are real challenges here. And as a result, there's just no universally obvious correct choice. There are times when one must probably act as a delegate, and times when one must act more as a trustee. So in light of that, let's come to our problem. Right? The first order of business from our gender and world politics perspective is to obtain formal representation, right? And this is where we're kind of just doing a review now. The formal representation section of our course, the stuff you read about obtaining suffrage and all that, that's what we mean by formal representation. The idea here is that when formal representation is present, whatever social group we're talking about has equal rights to participate in the full range of activities that are allowed in politics, right? So that would be at a minimum suffrage, right? The right to vote, but also the right to stand for office and be a representative, and also the removal of the kinds of barriers to a meaningful equal participation, such as discrimination and constitutionally or legally inscribed inequalities, right? So the removal of those kinds of things, right, are all necessary for formal representation to obtain, right? This might be likened to kind of what I'm talking about in my American politics course recently, what I'm talking about recently, the notion of equality of opportunity, right? As opposed to a much kind of bigger concept of equality of condition. Equality of opportunity, right, is the idea that we will accept, or there is an acceptance of hierarchies within society, right? But we do not accept that people are slotted into their rank in a hierarchy based on ascriptive characteristics, those which come to us at birth, like their gender or their race or ethnicity or caste or class status or something, but rather equality of opportunity, accepting hierarchies in society are, as is perhaps inevitable, but demanding that one's placement in that hierarchy is determined by some meaningful competitive process. Right? So an oversimplified way of saying this, equality of opportunity kind of implies a relatively level playing field at the outset. There are no obvious legal, constitutional obstacles in the way. We have rights of suffrage, we have rights to stand for office, we have the enforcement of non-discrimination statutes and things like that. Right? Once we have that relative equality of opportunity, we can say that formal representation has been obtained. That is to say, since women have the right to vote and run for office and participate in politics, and, the full range of political activities like party membership and attending rallies, and doing all the things that citizens do, that those who come to win office are representing them, whether they voted for them or not, or certainly whether or not they happen to be winning. So that's the formal representation, the representation that one enjoys by virtue of being afforded the full panoply of basic rights to participate in politics, so rights of association and things like that. Okay, so does that make sense? If you have formal representation, you are being represented in government because you had a chance, a legally equal chance to vote and run for your office, run for office yourself and things like that. The problem with formal representation is, as we've seen, it is clearly by itself an inadequate or no kind of assurance that women will find themselves holding positions of political power in anything like equal numbers. Right? In other words, formal representation has been shown to offer almost no assurance that parity, gender parity, will result. Right? We've seen the data. We know that the global average is about 5% in parliaments and things like that. Right? So we've also seen what the explanations are for why the numbers, why the data look the way they do. Right? We've talked about the cultural, socio-structural, and political institutional barriers that are gendered in profound ways. So given the limits of formal representation, feminists and critical race theorists, you name it, have recognized the importance of achieving descriptive representation, higher level, the next step up. Descriptive representation refers to the extent to which, representative assemblies, the extent to which the representatives resemble the people they are representing. Right? Specifically, their ascriptive characteristics, like race, sex, class, caste, and that sort of thing. If the assembly reasonably reflects the composition of society, then we can say that there is a reasonable degree of descriptive representation, meaning if there's, if 25% of the population is people of color and 25% of the assembly seats are held by people of color, and society is fairly evenly divided in terms of gender, then and the assembly is relatively equal in terms of gender, then we have a mirror essentially held up to society, and so we can say that we have a good degree of descriptive representation. Now, why do we need it? Right? What are the arguments for descriptive representation? Well, to be sure, this is not about reductionism or essentializing women. We do not have to argue or accept the argument that women are biologically determined, or that their interests are biologically determined, or that all women, because they are women, will, because of their biological nature, and share interests. That's clearly not the case, and not what anyone argues. But rather, as we've discussed, the quite common globally and historically experiences of women in terms of their socialization processes. Because of those socialization processes, women have, or those experiences have engendered women with a broad array of common concerns. And that's a very different thing from saying biological determinism, right? So for these concerns to be present, and you probably certainly can identify what those common concerns might be, right? Women's historical, traditional, and global responsibility for child rearing, things like that, give them concerns related to that. Right? So for these concerns to be present, get back to Pitkin, the argument is that women themselves must be in positions of political power. Right? Only women can be expected to reliably make present the concerns of women. We cannot assume that men can or will effectively represent the concerns of women. It's an assumption, or it's something that may be true on occasion. I mean, obviously, there are progressive men that will try to advance the concerns and interests of women, and we know that to be true. But we saw the data that we were discussing last opportunity. That I think it was something like where 25 to 30% of women legislators who were asked to comment but not given any hint just spontaneously mentioned that they saw women as an important part of their constituency, as compared to only 6% of men from the same assembly did. And so there's reason to believe that it does require the presence of women in politics to have made present their concern. So the idea is that the argument for descriptive representation is simply that women will bring to politics, as we said, their experientially determined values and expertise, and thus explore. Change politics, change political style, certainly lead to women driven policy, all that kind of stuff, right? Okay. So that's descriptive representation, and to achieve a greater level of descriptive representation, we spoke of the need for electoral institution design, things like quotas, electoral systems, which have been implemented across the world in great numbers, to overcome those barriers, those obstacles that we explored, that explain why formal representation that is now almost universal, there's one or two countries left in the world who don't give women formal representation, have not translated into meaningful numbers of women in public office, certainly nothing approaching parity. So the problem, right, is, again, or back to the problem, is will women necessarily act for or on behalf of them? So is descriptive representation enough? Is having women in office enough to ensure that their concerns are made present? Clearly not. Always, anyway, and certainly not all women. We can just always reach for Margaret Thatcher to make that point clear, right? Thus, perhaps the most important point here is descriptive representation should be seen as but a necessary but not sufficient condition for serving the interests of women. That's a kind of a classic logical construction. If you've not seen it before, this will not be your last time. So again, descriptive representation, having women in office, is merely a necessary but not a sufficient condition for making the interests of women present. What is further needed is what it can describe as substantive representation. And this is defined as being the actions of representatives that are taken on behalf of, or in the interest of, or as an agent of women. This is far more than just standing as women, but acting on behalf of for women. And kind of manifestations of substantive representation that we discussed in our last session are things like, seeing women as a distinct constituency within, of concern. That it involves having women in office who will in fact prioritize issues of greatest concern to women in terms of acts of parliament, violence against women, pay equity laws that ban workplace discrimination in terms of remuneration, things like that. Right? So seeing women as a distinct constituency, prioritizing their concerns, which again implies voting for women-friendly legislation, but also sponsoring, co-sponsoring that legislation, speaking up in debate, And I would say, I think Lois asked last time, or somebody did, Emily's list is indeed the model, I would say, for pursuing substantive representation. They, if you don't remember, fund only women candidates, but they don't stop there. Right? They don't fund conservative women. Right? They only fund progressive women who are dedicated to advancing the interests and concerns, or making present, right, the interests and concerns of women. And this is substantive representation. But remember, even having women in office that are committed to substantively representing women does not mean they will be able to effectively engage in substantive representation. That's because, as we've discussed, right, there are many factors that are recognized that limit the capacity of women to do just that. Right? There are factors such as their party membership, the party structure. Is there a strong party system where the party leadership can control how its members actually vote on matters before the House, by threatening to not allow them to run for office at the next election if they vote against the party. Do women have enough seniority to effectively influence outcomes, to sponsor legislation? Do they belong to a party that is actually governing, or do they belong to a small opposition party with no influence on what gets passed in terms of legislation? All these factors, right, influence and possibly limit substantive representation. So, so what we've done here is, kind of place the concerns about descriptive and substantive representation within the context of the larger discourse about representation, what it means in a democratic context, but specifically, what it means for our concerns about gender and gender politics, and seeing that formal, which is now almost universal, very key, formal representation obtained now across the globe, but the data that we've seen again and again show that alone is no guarantee, no assurance whatsoever that women will really actually find themselves in positions of power in meaningful numbers, so that descriptive representation is called for, and electoral engineering, like quotas, electoral systems are sometimes deemed necessary in order to obtain higher levels of descriptive representation, but we've seen that descriptive representation is but a necessary, not a sufficient condition to actually make the interests of women present, and for that we need a higher degree of representation, or substantive representation, that which is carried out by those committed to acting for, not just standing as women. Okay? And it is the substantive representation that we are more likely to get women-friendly policy. Okay, so hope that was helpful. If you've got questions, posted in the Facebook Messenger group, and of course, most importantly, remember. If you remember nothing else, remember. All right. Thanks very much, Cal.